Today we're going to talk about something called interfaces inside object-oriented PHP, and interfaces is a little bit more advanced than what we talked about in the past, and it is something that you may need to rewatch the episode a few times to understand fully. That's okay. It is one of the harder concepts to grasp, so if you have to do that, just go ahead and do it if you feel like you need to. Now, in order to properly describe what an interface is, we're going to do an example, the example that I have in front of me here. As you can see, I have three different classes. I have a class called PayPal, I have a class called Visa, and a class called Cash. So you can kind of guess here that we're working with different payment methods. Now, the best way to describe an interface is essentially that it's a blueprint that we use in order to group together specific classes to sort of tell them how they should behave. So essentially what type of method should be inside the classes in order for them to perform certain functions. That's what we're trying to do with interfaces. Now, you might not understand what an interface is with that explanation. So let's actually go ahead and do an example here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another class. And this class is going to be a class that actually performs some sort of purchase using one of these methods here. So let's say I have a class, and I call this one by product, curly brackets. Let's just go ahead and open it up here. Now, what this is going to do is essentially we're just going to have a method in here, and that method is going to take one of the above classes and use one of the classes. One thing we haven't talked about before is using classes within classes. That is something we can do as well. So we're going to take one of the above classes and we're going to actually run the pay now method inside one of these classes here. So inside, for example, PayPal, there's going to be some sort of code in here that runs the purchase using PayPal. Inside Visa, there's going to be something in there that actually runs the purchase using Visa. And then using Cash, it's going to be the same thing. So essentially, we're just purchasing using one of these different options here. So inside my by product class, I'm going to say we have a public function. I'm going to call it pay. And using this pay option here, this pay method, we're going to grab one of the payments up there and actually perform the purchase. Now, in order to tell this method what specific purchase method we're trying to use, we need to reference to one of these methods up here inside one of the classes. Now, do bear in mind, right now, we don't know what the customer is trying to do, pay with cash, Visa, PayPal, whatever. So we have to set this up in a way where we can use this specific method here later on in order to actually perform a purchase depending on what the customer decides to do. So what I need to do is I need to pass in some information inside this method here. So I'm going to say we want to pass in a payment type, which again hasn't been decided yet. So I'm going to say payment type. And now this is the point where we need to start talking about the previous episode where we talked about type hinting or type declaration. Because right now I need to define what specific type of information I'm passing inside this method here in order to define which one of these payment methods I want to use. Now, we talked about that when using type declarations, we could define if we wanted to pass in a string, an integer, a boolean, or something like that. But it's actually also possible to tell it that we want to pass in a specific type of object. So, when we actually create an object, let's just go ahead and create one down here. So what I can do is I can say I want to create a new payment type, and I want to set it equal to one of the payment methods we have up there. So a new, and then I just got to choose one of them. So I could say, for example, I want to pay cash. So now I'm creating a new cash object, based on the class called cash. And what I can then do is I can create another object that is going to be based off by product, because if I actually want to run the method inside by product, we also need to create an object based on that class. So I'm going to say I want to run another one, or I want to create another one. I'm just going to go ahead and call this one by products, which is going to be equal to new by products. So we want to pass in some information here, because when I reference to the by product and point to the method we have in here, which is called pay, we need to pass in the information of which specific object that I want to use in order to perform this purchase here. So I can pass in an object, which is going to be the new cash object we created here, meaning that right now, if I were to go inside my method up here, I gain access to all the properties and methods inside this cash class in order to perform this purchase here. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and use type declarations inside our method inside byProduct and say that right now we're passing in an object, which is going to be this one down here, which is based off the class called cash. So inside here, I can say, well, we have an object that is based off cash that we're passing inside this method here. So what I can then do is, because I'm using this object that has certain properties and methods inside of it, is I can actually go ahead and use the properties and methods inside this method inside byProduct. We're sort of diving into uncharted territory here because we haven't talked about passing in an object inside a method inside a different class, but I hope you sort of understand that we're just passing in an object, which means that I can now grab the object I'm passing into this method and then reference to either the properties and methods inside the object we created. So you know, right now we're basing the object off cash, so I can now use the properties and methods inside cash inside this method down here. So what I want to do is I want to refer to the pay now method we have in here. So I'm just going to do that. So now that I did that, everything is working out so far, except one little detail, which is that this line of code down here, which is the payment type, we don't know if the customer is going to be using cash, Visa, or PayPal. So what happens if the customer then decides that, okay, he's not going to pay with cash, he's going to use PayPal instead. So we're going to say PayPal. Now this is going to throw us an error message because right now inside our method, inside byProduct, we're actually asking for the cash type object to be passed inside this class here. So this is going to throw us an error message. So the question now is, how can we take all these three classes here and reference using one keyword all the three classes and then pass it inside our method down here? Well, we can use an interface for that. So what I can do is I can create a new interface that is going to group the methods from inside these classes here. So the way we do that, at least the way we create an interface, is by using the interface keyword. So I'm going to say interface, and then I'm just simply going to call it something. So in this case here, we could actually go ahead and call it something like a payment interface. So I'm going to say payment. Just going to go ahead and close it off with curly brackets. So what I need to do now is using this interface here, is I need to define what sort of rules should the classes follow if they want to use this interface here. Well, the first rule I'm going to write is that if a class follows this interface, then it needs to have a method called pay now. Like so. Actually, we don't need curly brackets here, we just need to sort of close it off there. So what I can then do is I can go down to the classes, and just like when we use the extends keyword in order to inherit properties and methods from other classes, we can go ahead and use another keyword called implements. So I'm going to say implements, and then I want to implement this interface up here called payment interface, which means that now it follows the rules of payment interface. So if I were to copy this, I can paste it inside the other ones down here because they also need to follow the rules up there. So now they all need to have pay now as a method inside their classes. Otherwise, this is going to give us an error message. Now, another good point about using interfaces, by the way, is that if you were to work in a team project and one person creates a class called PayPal, another person creates a class called Cash, then they need to be using the same names in order to perform the same similar actions inside those classes. So if one person decides to call this one payment now, then it's going to throw an error message because he needs to use the same name that we defined inside the rules of the interface. So that's just one little perk you can do there by using interfaces. So what we can do now is, because these classes has been grouped, to use this interface as a blueprint, we can now take the interface name, and instead of referring to cash, an object that is based off the cash class, is we can go and say, well, it has to be part of the payment interface that we created in order to be used inside as a parameter. So doing this instead, we're now using the interface as a medium in order to group together the classes and refer to all three classes when we want to use them as a type declaration inside something like another class here. Now, there is one issue though, because this might be all fine and dandy, grouping together classes, creating rules for them, creating a blueprint and then referring to the blueprint instead of the classes. But let's say that PayPal required that you log into a computer in order to pay, but the other two doesn't. So if I were to say, well, okay, if I were to go inside PayPal and create another function, just gonna copy paste. This one is gonna be called logging first, just to give it some kind of name. Then we're gonna run into an issue here, because once I actually buy the product down here, I also need to run the login first method if I were to decide that, okay, I'm actually using PayPal down here. The customer decided he's going to be using PayPal. We need to make sure that he logs in first to his PayPal account and then performs the payment. Which means that if I were to go down inside my buy product method, which is the one we run every single time the customer buys a product, I actually need to create another piece of code, in order to run a method that actually logs the guy in first before he performs the payment. So what I need to do here is I need to say, well, we also want to log in first and then I want to pay now. But now we're running into another issue because these two classes here don't have a login first method inside of them. So now we're going to get an error message if the guy decides to buy using cash. So how do we get around that issue? So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go ahead and create a separate method inside all of these classes here. So I'm going to say, well, okay, so we have, besides having the actual payment running and maybe a couple of different rules, like for example, the guy needs to log in first when it comes to PayPal, I'm also going to go ahead and create a method that is called public function. And this one is just going to be called payment process, which is a method that is going to just sort of be a handler that decides how is this process going to be run. So inside the curly brackets here, I can say, well, in PayPal's example, I am going to say that I want to use this and point to login first. And then just by copy pasting, I also want to make sure that I use pay now. So by running this one method, we run both these methods in here. Okay, so I can now copy paste, go down to the other ones, make sure they also have a payment process. Let's actually move that back to make sure that everything is aligned. Like so. Now these two down here don't actually need to have a login first, because remember, using Visa and using cash, we don't actually need to log in first. So those two down here are just going to take care of actually paying using these different types of payments. So now that we did this, we can actually go ahead and say, well, okay, so down inside buy product, I'm just going to go ahead and refer to payment process instead. So now we don't need to have two different types of methods being run inside this method down here. So now before we continue, let me just explain what exactly we've been doing here, because we haven't actually worked more with interfaces, because I just created this one interface up here and it still doesn't really explain why exactly we use interfaces. Now, what we did is basically we just set up 3 classes that inside of them all have a payment process that decides how we're going to be paying using this specific payment type. So with PayPal, we need to log in first and then we pay. Using Visa, we then just pay, and then with cash, we then just pay. That's what we're doing here. Now, all of these 3 classes belong to the payment interface, which means that if I were to use another class like the one down here, where I actually need to perform the payment using some information from the customer, then I just need to refer to the interface we created as a type declaration. So all of that is fine. That's what we learned so far. So now, because I have this one interface here called payment interface, I now created a set of rules that says, okay, if a class is part of this interface here or is implementing this interface, then it has to use the same rules as I applied inside the interface, meaning that the classes down here has to have a method called pay now. So let's say I also want to create a second set of rules. I'm going to create a second interface. I'm just going to go ahead and paste it down here. And what I want to call this one is something just a little bit different. So I'm going to call this one login interface, meaning that if you implement the rules from inside the login interface, it means that you have to log into a computer in order to have a properly working class. And we also need to make sure we change the rule inside the interface. So if you want to use the login interface, you also have to follow the rule that you need to log in first before you can perform a payment. So we have two sets of rules here, and we need to make sure we implement these correctly. So inside where we have PayPal as a payment option, I need to also say that besides needing to have a pay now method inside this specific class here, I also need to have a login interface, because it requires that because PayPal needs to log in to a computer in order to perform a payment, it also needs to follow this rule set here. Let's go ahead and create a fourth payment type. So I know I'm going to be creating a bank transfer option, meaning that if I were to copy the PayPal class, which I know is going to follow the same rule sets as a bank transfer, I'm just going to go ahead and rename this one. So bank transfer. It has to implement, first of all, the payment interface, because we need to pay at some point using, whatever payment method this is. And we also need to log into a computer in order to perform a bank transfer. So because we need to follow these rule sets, if I forget at some point to include let's say a pay now method, this is going to throw me an error message, and it's going to tell me inside the browser, you need to insert a payment or a pay now method in order to do this. So essentially you just need to sort of see that we're grouping together different classes. So right now these two classes called PayPal and bank transfer are also grouped together under the rule of login interface. Now I do want to point one more thing out, which is that right now you've been seeing me use just one specific rule inside each interface. I can, if I want to, add multiple rules inside these interfaces, meaning that all the different classes that refer to, let's say, the login interface needs to follow all the different method rules that we have inside this specific interface here. I hope this is sort of starting to make sense to you when it comes to interfaces. Again, just remember, interfaces is basically a way for us to create a blueprint that we can then implement into classes in order for the classes to follow a specific set of rules, meaning that it makes it easier to name things the same way throughout all the different classes if they have the same functionalities. It is a way for us to reference to a group of classes if you want to use them inside a separate method, like the one I have inside my byproduct class down here. So when we have to use the the type declaration, we can do that in a much easier way. So I hope there's a bell inside your head that is sort of lighting up and telling you, oh, okay, I can kind of see why we're using interfaces inside our code when it comes to object-oriented PHP. If there's not a bell lighting up, I do hope that you have the time to watch the video again, just to sort of fully understand why we use interfaces. I tried to explain this in a very, I would say comprehensive manner, but I may not have done that in a very good way. But at least I hope that some people could sort of understand what exactly an interface is when it comes to object-oriented PHP. I will leave the documentation for what interfaces are inside the description of this video. It leads you to the php.net page that actually describes interfaces. Now, I do also want to point out that the link I'm giving you to php.net that has the explanation to it, it doesn't really do a very good job of explaining why we use interfaces. It just explains how we use interfaces. But if you go down to the included comments that are further below the page, the first one, which is from, you can actually see the first comment down here that has a lot of upvotes, actually describes how interfaces are used and why we use interfaces. So if you need just an explanation more on how exactly interfaces are used inside PHP, then the comment section also describes very well when we use interfaces. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you in the next one.